Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last chapter of the semester for learning and memory related to social learning, another kind of big picture topic like emotional memory, but in this case, relevant to social behaviors, which hopefully you can see the connections between what you've learned before and how it manifests in more of a easily accessible real world scenario. So this might be a slightly longer video than some of the ones that I've done previously, but I want to set the stage and really talk about the difference between true imitation and similar behaviors that don't quite make it to that level of cognitive complexity, at least in terms of how the cognitive psychologists would argue about it. And all of this really stems from a historical standpoint when we started to see a split between the ideas of really true behaviorists and what were the beginnings of the cognitive revolution in psychology. And really the classic studies that got the ball rolling here are from Bandura and colleagues. So those of you that are in history and systems, we just talked a little bit about Bandura very recently. But to talk a little bit about this work, Bandura was doing this work really when televisions were first becoming common in the home, and people were concerned about whether or not children in particular would be impacted by what they saw uh, on screen, right? And so we still debate about this today, right? In video games and movies and television and things like this. But this was very new, and whether or not people could be influenced by what they saw without actually practicing those behaviors was something that people were really interested in. And so what Bandura did was to look at whether or not children would copy aggressive behaviors that they watched adults do on screen. And so they did kind of two different manipulations here where children would watch an adult engaging in aggressive behavior. And so they had this toy that was common at the time called a Bobo doll, just an inflatable doll. And the adults would either, kind of quietly play and not be aggressive, or they would really beat the crap out of that Bobo doll, as you can see in some of those still images. Kick, punch, throw, right, climbing on top of the doll and hitting it, right? So children were exposed to one of those two conditions. And then at the level of the test, some children were provoked by having their favorite toy taken away and others were not. So they end up with 4 different groups here and looked at the pattern of results in terms of which children would actually engage in those aggressive behaviors. And so what they found is that for the children that were provoked, those that had seen an adult model also being aggressive were much more likely to be aggressive themselves. And what they actually saw that was very interesting is that they often copied very specific actions and words from the adult. That is, they were clearly trying to specifically model the behavior of the adult they had seen doing those aggressive actions, right? So not just being aggressive in a different way, but doing exactly the same thing they had seen the adult do on screen. For the children that were unprovoked, those that had viewed the adult aggression were less likely to be aggressive themselves, which was interesting, right? That they could separate that context. Seeing the aggression didn't make them be aggressive across the board, but only if they were kind of angered or provoked ahead of time. So this was really interesting in terms of those results, right? But even though the pattern is maybe a little bit complex, it's also fairly clear that adults' behavior was influencing child behavior just through this type of observation. And early cognitive psychologists, and the way that we think about it even today, right, is that this kind of behavior in the children, where they engaged in very specific modeling of exact behaviors and verbalizations, seems to involve what we would call perspective taking, that they could put themselves, right, kind of in the position of those adults, and that they would engage in those exact behaviors, right? And so, especially at the time, this was a pretty big blow to behaviorism that would argue that we either would have to be conditioned to do something, or we would have to be rewarded or punished to change behavior. In this case, though, there's no reward or punishment going on. There's no classical conditioning, but these children are simply observing behaviors and then deciding when to engage in those behaviors based on the situation. So there's a clear cognitive aspect going on here. So that challenged behaviorism at the time, right? We saw strong social learning in the absence of any specific reinforcement, right? And it really can't be understood in simple stimulus response type of terms, right? And because this was such a big deal, people continued to engage in studying this question in a lot of different ways, right, to see whether or not this was really cognitive or whether it could be explained using behaviorism type of principles, right? So some people tried to argue that social learning is really just a form of observational or classical conditioning, or that actions can be copied without having complex cognitive skills, right? And so the big picture takeaway there is that through trying to probe the boundaries of this type of social learning, it's really led to some distinctions between very similar but not quite exactly the same types of behaviors, right? So what's the difference between true imitation and other forms of what we would still consider what look like socially conditioned or transmitted behaviors? So when we talk about social learning, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. We have a nice definition of true imitation that involves copying specific actions that are learned from another individual, right? And so using the Bobo doll study, right, not just also beating up on the Bobo doll, but hitting it or kicking it in the exact same way as the adult and yelling the exact same types of aggressive phrases, right? So that would be true imitation. Again, from a cognitive point of view, that's arguing that the child, the learner, is encoding those specific actions of the model, right? And then chose to select those exact memories, right? Those exact movements to guide what they're doing in a certain situation. In that case, when they were provoked by having a toy they wanted taken away. And so the argument is that there's a cognitive complexity there, right? That perspective taking kind of situation, right? And again, at the time, and as others followed up, behaviorists pointed out that there are other things that seem like true imitation, but are probably more simple forms of learning that are more compatible with simple behaviorism principles. And so these would include 4 different categories that we'll talk about: emulation, observational conditioning, contagion, and stimulus enhancement. So again, the big picture takeaway at this point is that these 4 types of learning that have been described wouldn't reach the level of true imitation. They're not as cognitively complex as true imitative behavior. So let's look at each of these. First 2 we'll tackle pretty quickly. These are a little bit more straightforward and easy to understand. So emulation would be accomplishing the same goal as a model, but in a different way. So in this case, we can still use the Bobo doll as an example, right? So a child might attack the Bobo doll, but not in the exact same way as the adult modeled, right? And I think there's a little bit of, interesting difference in cognitive thought going on here, right? In some ways, you could argue that trying to accomplish a goal in a different way does have a cognitive aspect, but it's not the same as true imitation because it's not modeling the specific behavior. So this is interesting, right? But it's a little more ambiguous in terms of what the observer is trying to accomplish, right? They might just want to achieve the same end and learn their own way of doing it. And that learning could happen outside of more complex cognitive demands. So it doesn't quite fit that perspective taking aspect that we talk about with true imitation. So it's a little bit of a distinction, right? But the big picture thing there is that it's not the same actions, even though the goal might be the same. Contagion is more of a natural tendency of animals of a species to react to cues from other members of the same species, right? So there's two very classic examples of this that you read about, right? We've all experienced yawning when someone else near us yawns, right? It's reflexive. It's not something that we decide to do, but it happens automatically, right? That reflexive behavior. And for some people, this also happens with vomiting. Luckily, not something I experience, especially having kids, that would be problematic, right? But many people do have that experience where if they see somebody else throw up, it makes them nauseous and feel like they're going to throw up as well, right? This is reflexive. It's not something where the person is deciding to model that behavior in a more cognitively complex way. Next up, we talk about observational conditioning, right? And so this one gets a little more complicated in some ways to think about, right? So this is when cues in the environment become associated with types of contagion-like reactions, right? So what we just talked about, like examples like yawning and vomiting. And so we're going to talk about a different type of example here, right? So a common example would be how animals react to threats in their environment. A lot of these studies are done in animals, again, to show that kind of these behaviors can happen and they're not necessarily cognitively complex, right? So if you imagine a scenario where, you know, a naive or a young monkey sees a snake for the first time, it doesn't necessarily know if that snake is a threat or not, but other monkeys who have experienced snakes before start to freak out and scream and do their kind of danger calls that you would expect when an animal sees a predator. This naive or young monkey also starts to engage in those same behaviors because of a contagion response. It's very common for members of animal species to mimic or copy the actions of other animals when they engage in these types of behaviors, right? And so in this scenario, that new monkey now links the sight of that snake with the yelling and screaming and calling of danger out to the other monkeys. So even though that monkey hasn't necessarily experienced the snake as a danger directly, the next time it sees a snake, it's going to engage in those types of warning calls and behaviors, right? So this is how we can see social transmission through a more basic kind of association type of learning. This is really just classical conditioning, right? Snake paired with other monkeys freaking out, new monkey's also going to freak out, right? You don't really need complex cognitive associations going on here in order to do this. The monkey doesn't need to understand why the other monkeys are afraid, right? It's engaging in that kind of freak out response just based on that contagion type of behavior, right? And so this is one of those situations where this can really seem like true imitation, right? But experimental designs can help address this. And so this is what you read about in the book. And it's often a little tricky to understand. So hopefully talking about it again here can help with that. And really observational conditioning like this, right? We can say that it's dumb and that it's not cognitively complex. It's totally reflexive and it really seems to be more classical conditioning type of learning than something that requires complex cognitive thought to do. So in this type of experiment, we have a model blackbird that is kind of the same as the adult model in the Bandura studies, you can think of it that way, that's been trained to attack a stuffed owl. This would be a kind of natural predator adversary for the bird in its environment, right? And so we train that bird to attack a stuffed version of that owl. And then we have a second bird we can call the naive bird that is going to observe the attack behavior from that model bird. But instead of seeing a stuffed owl, right, the equivalent of what we would, and we just talked about in terms of the monkey and a snake out in the environment, but here in the lab, we have this little wheel set up such that it can see the other bird, but instead of seeing the owl, it's seeing a plastic bottle. Now, when this second bird sees the model bird start attacking, it also starts to attack in the same way that the monkey would start freaking out and doing its danger calls when the other monkeys see the snake, right? So in this case, though, this isn't an actual type of danger, right? It's just a plastic bottle. But because it started to attack this plastic bottle, it now starts to learn through conditioning that this bottle is some sort of threat that should be attacked. And so whenever that stimulus is now around, in this case, the bottle, it's going to attack the bottle, right? So this is kind of a nice way of showing that there's not a cognitive complexity going on here. That contagion response paired with the animal doing that attack behavior just leads to learning to attack whatever's there at the time, right? There's no reason that that bird should actually be wanting to attack that bottle other than it's now paired the contagion response of attack with the stimulus that was present at that time, right? So it's a little tricky, but I think thinking through that can help. If you have questions about that, though, please continue to ask on the discussion board or send an email. Final example of a behavior that would kind of fit in here is stimulus enhancement. So an example here, right, this is something that teachers at all levels try and do all the time, right, by directing attention of a student to particular parts of the environment, to things to pay attention to, right? So I could, circle something for you to pay attention to, and that would hopefully draw your attention to that part of the screen, right? Things like that are common in education all the time. It's also common in general in the world, especially for parents with kids, right? So for example, if you point out that the floor is wet, tell your child to be careful to not run on the floor, right? In that case, the child may be faster to learn that when the floor is wet, you're going to fall and slip if you try and run on it. But there's still kind of traditional conditioning that goes on here. The stimulus enhancement makes the association more salient. You might see that learning happen more quickly, right? Almost like highlighting a discriminative stimulus in the environment. When floor is wet, don't run, right? If you want to think about kind of a observational conditioning kind of situation. But it doesn't require cognitive operations in that case. So again, the concept of true imitation in general, copying specific actions that you've learned from another member, usually of the same species, seems to be more cognitively complex. I think that part is the hardest thing to appreciate, especially when you compare it to emulation. But the argument is that engaging in those same actions as the model, whether it's an adult in the Bandura studies, right, or whatever, that kind of perspective taking is a more complex cognitive action than the more classical types of conditioning that we've talked about, right? So you can think of these other four things as similar. They can look like true imitation, but they're more simple and they're more easily explained using simple kind of behaviorism as opposed to cognitive psychology principles, right? So the last thing I want to talk about here, and I know this has been a little bit long, is how we can try and study this, right? If these other non-true imitation things exist, how do we show that true imitation really occurs? And from a comparative psychology point of view, what species seem to be able to do this? If this is a more complex cognitive type of learning, what other than humans can actually do this? And it looks like true imitation does occur, right? The Bandura studies were a clue, but through different tasks that have been developed to show this, it seems like other primates and even dolphins might be able to do these kinds of tasks as well. So let's take a quick look at what we call two action tests and do as I do. So in this kind of experimental design, the two action test seems to detect true imitation. And we can see this in kids. So we see this type of behavior early, and we also see it in chimpanzees, our closest relative. What we typically see, this is kind of a classic example of a two-action test, is that we have a box with some pins, and we can have an adult, if we're looking at kids or chimpanzees, right? The experimenter is often the model there as well, that either open the box by poking the pins out of the latch or by twisting and pulling them out of the latch. So there's two different ways that this box can be opened, right? Afterwards, we'll look, whether we're looking at chimpanzees or humans, to see if they copy the exact same way of opening the box, right? So if they copy the exact same way, true imitation. If they do it a different way, maybe more emulation, or at least not true imitation in that case, right? And so if we look at the results, our y-axis here, it's a little bit complicated, right? But we're looking at more twist-like behaviors at the bottom end and more poke-like behaviors at the higher end here. And so we can see in orange, these would be individuals that saw the adult model do the poking technique, and in purple, saw the adults doing the twisting technique, right? And so in the children, we see really nice separation, right? If they saw the adult poke, they tried doing the poking way. And if we saw the twist in the adult model, the children do the twist. The monkeys, it's a little more variable. They do a little bit maybe mixed, but they still, if they saw the adult doing the poke, they were scored as more doing a poking technique. And if they saw the twist, they were scored as doing more of a twisting technique. So they did seem to be imitating the specific behavior of the adults, right? Maybe the chimpanzees, right, because it's a little more mixed, maybe they were doing some imitation and some emulation, but it is a nice dividing line there. They still did more twisting if they saw twisting, and more poking if they saw poking. What was really interesting, you don't have the data here, but adult humans actually show a mix of imitation and emulation as well, right? And again, I think this gets back to what I was talking about, where you could argue in some cases that emulation is also could be showing cognitive complexity in a different way, right? In trying to find additional ways to solve a problem is certainly something that we would consider a cognitive behavior. And I think that's kind of highlighted by that particular result, right? So, but at the very least, we can say that humans, and at least chimps to some degree, seem to show the ability to engage in true imitation. Second example, and I don't want you to worry quite as much about this one, but I'll wrap up with this. It's called a do as I do task, right? And so we can train animals to, you know, quote unquote, do this, you know, for a different type of command, where a reward is given to the animal only if they repeat the exact behavior that the trainer does next, right? So an example could be a trainer signs do this, then claps her hands, right? And because monkeys can learn sign language, right, if they've been trained, the monkey has to clap its hand to get a reward, right? So we first have to train an animal on this concept, and then the trainer has to demonstrate a new action, right? So something the animal hasn't learned and hasn't been rewarded before. And what we see in these types of studies as well, right? They're usually small ends when we're working with monkeys, right? But 2 chimps could complete 30 novel actions, right? And dolphins can learn this game as well, right? It has to be actions that dolphins can do, but they can learn to basically copy and imitate new actions after they've been trained on this type of task, right? And so these are 2 non-human species that seem to have that cognitive ability to represent, right, the experimenter as the model and repeat those otherwise arbitrary actions, right? Simple behaviorism views can't explain why this type of thing would happen. So social learning via true imitation, right, does seem to be more cognitively complex. All right, a lot of stuff in there, right? Focus, at least on what I've talked about here, right? There's other parts of this chapter that you also want to know, and you should feel free to ask questions about. But in separating true imitation from those similar behaviors, focus on the cognitive complexity, right? True imitation requires that perspective taking, which is something that many animals can't do, although chimps and dolphins seem to be able to do those types, at least in certain cases, right? And those are animals that we would consider to be more intelligent. This is one example of why. All right, I'll post probably a super quick video on mirror neurons. It's not too complicated of a concept. We don't really have a complicated brain network to think about for this chapter, but I will post a little video about mirror neurons later that you should take a look at as well. All right, keep staying safe, and I will talk to you again soon.